Today I'm going to show you the step-by-step process of how I hand cut dovetails. Now there's several different ways out there how to hand cut dovetails. This is just the way I do it. I'm not saying this is the right way or the wrong way or somebody else's way is right or wrong. What I really recommend is you pick one way to do it and you really master that way. Once you've mastered that way, go and try to add different things and figure out what works best for you. But trying something once and then moving on to a different technique, that's where you're going to start to confuse yourself. So really pick one path, try that for several times, and really understand it before you try to change it up. So let's get started. First thing we're going to go over is tool selection. One thing that I really want to stress is I've been hand cutting dovetails for about 2 to 3 years now, and I've really created a brand around it. When you're first starting out, you don't need the nicest or the fanciest tools, and that's not how I started either. It wasn't until I started to sell pieces of furniture and get paid for my dovetails that I started to buy some of the nicer equipment. So the first things we're going to cover is layout tools. One of the very first thing is a marking gauge. This is from Bob Miller from Mass Woodworks. This is my favorite type of marking gauge. This is the one I really recommend. There are some other wheel style marking gauges. This is a Veritas and this is a Wood River. This has 2 different blades and this is a single one. The next is a good combination square. This is a Starrett and I really like it. There are other brands out there that you can go with. The next layout tool is going to be a set of dividers. This is just a cheap set of dividers from Amazon. This is the Veritas saddle square, and this is what I use to actually mark all the lines. And then I use a good pencil and a good marking knife. A file, this is just a coarse wood file. You wouldn't think that you would really need this, but I'll show you later in the video where this comes in handy. And again, you don't need a huge set of chisels. I'm going to only be using 2 different chisels today. These are the Veritas PMV 11s, but these aren't the chisels I started with. You could start with any good chisel as long as it's sharp. A mallet. This is a dovetail alignment board that I got from Jonathan Katz-Moses. He sells these on his website. Highly recommend picking one up. A fret saw, and the reason why I use a fret saw over a coping saw is because it allows me to speed up. I can drop this all the way into the baseline and cut across, which minimizes my chiseling time. I'll show you later the path that a fret saw would take versus the path of a coping saw, and you can make the decision on which one's best for you. And the last tool is a dovetail saw. So this is the dovetail saw that I currently use. This is a Bad Axe Toolworks dovetail saw. Again, this isn't the dovetail saw I started out with. I didn't purchase this until like a 1.5 years in, where I was making money on my dovetails. Let me show you a great option. This is the Veritas dovetail saw. This is what I originally started with. For a Western style saw, I think this is the best bang for your buck. Don't quote me on this, but when I purchased this, I think it was around $70 to $80, and this saw served me very well. Great saw. I've put it through a bunch of use. You can see this handle's all beat up, chipped out back here, but it still cuts. I used it the other day, and I'll cut with it today so you can see and compare this between the Bad Axe. So let's get to the first step of cutting dovetails. The first step for me is labeling and layout. And when you think of labeling, what is that? That means that all 4 joints will line up perfectly in the end. So when I'm transferring the tails to the pins, I want to make sure that I'm transferring the right tails to the right pins. So I'm going to show you the trick that I use to label it to make sure they all line up in the future. The first thing I do is I flip the boards around and figure out the layout that I want each board to be in. So I'm looking for the outside face and what is going to be up or down. Just trying to give me the best layout look. So once I have that, I'm going to use 2 different labeling things. I'm going to do tails out, which is TO, and pins out, which is PO. So I'm going to cut the tails into these 2 boards. So this is going to be tails out, tails out. And then I'm going to do the same for my pin boards. Pin out, pin out. Now, to make sure that the joints line up properly, I'm going to use a numbering system 1 through 4. My front tails is going to be 1 and 2, And because this is going to be lined up with 1, that's going to be 2. Now for my back side, this is actually going to be flipped. So this is going to be 3 and 4, and it's going to mate like that. So when I do the 2 pin boards, this is going to be 3, and this is going to be 4. With all 4 boards labeled, I'm now going to lay out the baseline, and this is where the marking gauge comes into play. So this is already preset, but I'll show you guys how I set it. So I pick the board up, and I try to get the very tip of the knife to seat just on the edge of it. And once I have that, I'll tighten down the thumb screw, and that'll be my layout. Perfect. So, and then to transfer these over, I just do a few strikes. You don't need to go too hard. Take smaller, lighter passes. It makes it a lot easier. And since this is a tail board, you see that I'm also scribing the shoulder line. For the pin boards, I'm just going to do the 2 faces because I don't have to cut that that half tail off. So that's why on the tail boards you need to scribe the sides, and on the pin boards you don't. The last thing I want to go over before putting the wood into the vise is my bench setup. So this is a Moxon vise that I have attached using some Bessie F-style clamps. So this is actually removable. This hardware is from Benchcrafted, really good hardware, and this vise has served me very well. The other thing I have here, you can see, is this little bench light that just attaches with a screw clamp onto my vise, or onto my bench, excuse me, and it just gives me a nice raking light. Again, I'll leave descriptions and links to all the items that I've discussed so far down below in the comment section. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me personally. The first thing to do to actually lay out the tails is I'm going to mark this half pin on each side. So the way I do that is I use my combination square. This is an arbitrary number. It's set slightly below 1/4 of an inch. So I'm going to butt that up and strike a line on both sides. Now that I have that laid out, I can come back and I can use my dividers to get the even spacing of the tails. So the way I'm going to do this is put it on that half pin line and go like that. And so you see the space from this half pin to that's how big the spacing would be in between the dovetails. So I want to change that up. So I got to open these up quite a bit. And you see again, we're off a little bit. The way I like to lay out my dovetails is I like small pins and large tails. So let's see if we can get something that we like. And again, this is all arbitrary. So we're almost there. So that's looking pretty good. I like that. That's a relatively small distance. So that's what I'm actually going to use. So let's lay these out. Now I'm going to take my Veritas saddle square and I'm actually just going to put it on those lines and draw the tails. So the way I cut my dovetails is I always cut from this side. So to cut these ones that are going this direction, what I would actually do is flip the board over and transfer the lines to the back side. But so you can see what the tails will look like, I'll transfer these lines on the front as well. So we have 3 dovetails with small pins and large tails, so that's going to be our layout. So let's get to cutting. Like I said earlier, I like to cut my tails all from one direction. So I cut from right to left. That gives me good muscle memory and so that I'm always in a proper cutting position. So what I'm going to do now is flip this board around and transfer those lines and cut again, giving me the same orientation, that left to right cutting motion, because that's what I'm used to. So with those 3 lines marked, I'm gonna start cutting. One thing you want to make sure, you don't want to tilt your saw forward or back, because cutting from the backside, I can't see my show face. So if I dig this in like that, what's going to happen is I'm going to go way past my baseline on the show face. So just cut straight to the baseline, and now we just need to remove that waste. For cutting out the waste using the fret saw, I again flip the board around so I have my show face. That's in case this saw does tilt at all. It won't tilt on my show face. So I just drop this down, I turn it, and I get it right in that baseline and cut straight across. Just like that. Now, if you're newer to cutting dovetails and you don't want to cut past your baseline, there are a few tricks you can do. I've already pre-cut this side. So what you can do is you could drop down, don't get so close to your baseline, and chop like this. Now this pretty much negates all the benefits of a fret saw, because this is how a coping saw would actually cut. You'd come down, because the blade's not as thin as this with a coping saw, you can only make cuts like that. So again, I prefer doing like this, dropping it in the baseline, and just nice and easy, and taking that over to minimize my chiseling, because this is going to take me a lot longer to chisel out. So you can see I have 2 different ones that I need to chisel out. This is one where I did more of like a fret saw style cut, and this is one where I did more of a coping style cut. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just drop that chisel right into that baseline, because we're so close to it, and just knock it down. There's very little material to remove, but with this one, if I went straight back there like that, this could split out. So what I'm going to have to do is I'm going to have to take this in several smaller passes. And I'm working from the show face down. Now I'm going to flip it over and clean it up. Now, because I've already gone from the show face down, I don't have to worry about tearing it out, because we're already right to that baseline. Just small little taps. Just a few little more. So I cleaned both of those up right to the baseline. You can see that the fret saw one went a lot quicker than cutting like a coping saw. So that's why I prefer the fret saw over the coping saw. The last thing to do for the tailboard is cutting this half pin. So if you remember back when I was using the marking gauge, I actually scribed a baseline on the top. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to drop my saw right into that baseline and saw down. Pretty simple. And then I'm going to come back, and if there's anything that needs to be taken care of, I'm just going to clean that up. But this one looks pretty great. The baseline there, as well as right there, look nice and perfect. Here is our first tailboard. So you can see it's 3 complete tails. The waist in the middle, as well as the shoulders, is completely gone. So I'm going to cut the tails in the other board, and then I'll show you how I transfer the pins and cut those. To transfer the tails to the pins, we're going to use that dovetail alignment board that I was talking about. We're also going to be using labeling, and this is why we started that in the beginning. So as you can see here, I got pin out 3, so that's going to come out towards me. I'm going to put this in, making sure it's 90. Push that up. And just snug everything up with the vise, and then just give it a few more turns. I now take tail out 3 and I'm going to transfer those lines. To transfer those lines, I'm going to use a marking knife. So I'm going to drop this in. And again, because these are all square, I know my joint will then be square. So take that over. And for smaller pieces like this, thumb pressure just works fine. But if you wanted to, you could put a clamp right there to make sure that nothing moves. And to use that marking knife, I just kind of put it right up against the tail and just strike down. Similar to the marking gauge, you don't want to take a really heavy line to start. So you can take a bunch of smaller ones and then just kind of make it deeper as you go. So once I have those lines marked out, I'm going to mark out my waist to make sure that I cut out the right thing. Unlike the tails, for my pins, I'm going to cut everything with the face facing towards me. So I just drop my saw right in that knife line and cut straight down. The one trick that I will recommend is knowing which side you want to keep and which side you want to get rid of. So when you're new, you can kind of stay off that knife line and then work up to it using a chisel or a file. And then once you get more confident, you can kind of cut straight into that knife line. And again, I want to keep my saw nice and straight, and then I don't want it rocking at all. So just line that up. And one way to keep the saw straight instead of tilting one way to another is I put my finger right here, and that kind of gives me a guide. Once I get the saw set, I just put the finger on the other side, and that helps me keep it nice and straight. And the last one. And everything looks pretty good. Everything's right down to the baseline. So that looks really good. So we're gonna come back with the fret saw and cut the waist out. Similar to the tailboard, I'm gonna drop my fret saw all the way down to the baseline and give it a few strokes. And because this is angled, I'm going to start angling my dovetail saw. I don't want to cut into this pin in the back. So if I was going straight, I would start to cut into that. So I'm going to angle it like that to make sure I cut at the back and the front at the same time. And you can see that's pretty much dead on with the baseline. One thing that I want to make sure of is if the saw is gonna deviate at all, I don't want it to deviate down. I want it to deviate up. If I deviate down, I can't come back and fix that. I've cut actually into my face. If I deviate up, I can come back and clean that up with a chisel. So let me cut the next two out. Here's a joint coming right off the saw. If you look at the baselines, I really didn't need to do a whole lot of cleanup. It looks pretty good. So I'm gonna try to fit this. And this isn't with any finessing yet. So I haven't chiseled any of the walls or anything like that. And so just a few light taps and that joint seated perfectly along there, as well as up here. Everything's looking nice and tight. So that's a really good joint. I was able to get it to fit with just a few taps of the hammer. So here's that first joint cut. Really happy with how it came out. You can see that the pins and tails are slightly proud. What I'll come back through is I'll knock those down either with a sander or a block pane, depending on how I'm feeling that day. So that's going to do it for how to cut this dovetail. I'm going to finish this box up in a different build, but I do want to show you some tricks that I was talking about if you do have some problems fitting your dovetail. So let's go to those now. I roughed out a set of tails and pins to show you those little tips and tricks I was talking about. These do not fit. They were transferred properly, and then I cut in about a quarter of an inch to an eighth of an inch into my waist side to show you how I'm going to deal with it. I also kind of cut a hump into here to show you how I deal with that as well. So one thing you can do is use a chisel. The thing with the chisel is you don't want to take off too much. Now for this, relatively simple because I do have my baseline because I cut so far in from that. So I could work back to that baseline. So on this one, it's a little bit wider. I can just take this and come down. One thing I will recommend is take material off your pins, not off your tails. And so I just come in like this, and I'm able to bring that down. Now I do need to come back here and clean this up. And that's pretty good. For this hump, what I'm going to do is I can put part of the chisel in that baseline and kind of work back like this. This hump's not super severe, but what I want to avoid doing is accidentally losing control and then coming back like that and taking out a big chunk like that. So one trick that you can do is use that wood file. Because this isn't a super severe hump. I could just give it a few and that's pretty flat now. A little bit in the back. And that looks really, really good. Obviously where I put that nick in from that chisel isn't gonna look great, but that's one of the areas where you can use that wood file. The next is right here. This, I cut it in a little bit farther than I wanted. So what I'm gonna first do is pare down a little bit, just to give it, then I'm gonna take that wood file and work back to that line. You don't want to take off too much. I could always take off more material, but I can't add any more material on. So let's see how this fits. So it's a little tight on both sides. So I'm going to use that wood file. So that one's good. This one is pushing out a little bit, and you can see how I got a little bit of tear out right there. That's okay, because I'm not going to be able to see that. It just lets me know where I need to take material. And I'm going to come back and just square this pin up from the top side. All right, and it looks like we're catching right down here, so one last fitting. And that looks pretty good. The baseline I cut back here isn't great. I just rushed through that. But I want you to focus on these two baselines that I just had to fit. So between there and there and there and there. And everything looks really good. I'll take a picture of it to give you a close-up view, but that's how I would attack it using a wood file. And I highly recommend using a wood file over a chisel. Thank you for watching this video on how I hand cut dovetails. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them below in the comment section, as well as you can reach out to me on here, my Instagram, or you can find my email down below. I have links to all my socials and my website, as well as everything that I talked about. There's links in that. So this is the final box. Came out pretty good. Need to sand it down, get some finish on it, do the bottom and the top. But all four of the corners of the dovetails look pretty good. These will be for sale on my website, and I will be making a full video on how I actually make this box, as well as a few other variations. So thank you so much for watching this video, and have a great day.